Thanks, Guido. Thanks everyone for being here. Let's see. I'm gonna share my screen. Everyone can see. Okay, is it on the full screen version? Okay,
Yes.
cool. Thank you. Yeah, as Guido said, this workshop we'll be covering the steps for conducting research on your own farm. And yeah, the inspiration came from all you farmers doing, constantly experimenting and troubleshooting on your farms, and wanted to cover some of the, steps that you can follow to make sure that, everything that you're trialing on your farm is done in sort of a systematic way so that you can really have confidence in your results and confidence in what you're actually trying is doing what you want it to, right? So we'll be covering a couple of things that you can do to do this sort of research on your farm. And the idea is that that research will be very relevant to what you want to, what questions you have, what you want to test, make sure that it's effective and that it's really tailored to your farm, your geography, your sort of community, and really make sure that um, it's actually serving your needs. So yeah, I'll be covering some of the objectives for this workshop. We'll be starting with learning some of the basic principles of research and how to, the steps to conducting an on-farm experiment. And then we'll cover some of the practical tools and techniques you can use. And then we'll also be covering some of the different organizations and resources that are out there that will help you and support you when you're wanting to start your own research project. So yeah, I'll introduce my fellow panelists. We have Ellie Andrews from UC Cooperative Extension for Sonoma, Marin, and Napa counties. She'll be covering some of those principles of on-farm research. And then we have Reyna Yagi with Yagi Sisters Farms, and she'll talk through some of her motivation for pursuing research and then also how she drafted her research question. And then I'll be covering some of the tools and techniques for the small scale farmer. And then we'll lastly have Caiti Hachmyer with Red H Farms talking about her experience with the WSARE research grant, which is one of the funding opportunities that are available for farmers. So yeah, I'll pass it off to Ellie. Sharing.
Okay. Thanks. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so thanks so much for the introduction. My name is Ellie Andrews, and I am the Specialty Crops Advisor with UC Cooperative Extension. As she mentioned, I'm based in Sonoma, Marin, and Napa counties, and I'm going to be talking about the steps of on-farm research. So this photo was taken on my first day of research in an orchard in Southern California way back in 2019 when I was a grad student at UC Davis. So to begin with, what is on-farm research? We have this really nice guide called The Farmer's Guide to Conducting On-Farm Research that's put out by the Organic Farming Research Foundation that I'm going to be referencing for the next couple slides. So research is just the systematic process of investigating a topic to discover new information by studying and analyzing data. So you're testing your hypotheses to gain new insights. And on-farm research is a kind of applied research. So we're focused here on finding practical solutions to real-world problems, right? So that's really different than basic research or research that's like focused on the foundational nature of photosynthesis or something like that. Like that research is important too, but that's not what we're talking about at this workshop. We're really focused on applied research in the field, focused on real-world problems and solutions. So I want to acknowledge, of course, that farmers are constantly experimenting with different practices on their farms all the time. And one of the things this guide really highlights nicely is that farmers benefit when they lead on-farm research trials at their own farms. So an on-farm research trial is where you systematically evaluate production practices on your farm through comparisons, usually between a control and treatments, but it can look like a lot of different things. I'm going to focus on research trials that compare a control and treatments, and I'll explain what that means in a second. So why would you go about doing this? Well, why would you do on-farm research in the first place? It allows you to explore and address your own farm-specific questions. It helps you support innovation and adoption of sustainable practices. It gives you the structure or a system for really effective comparisons, measurements, and assessments. And ultimately, it helps you gain confidence in your conclusions about those practices and choices. Here's a really nice anecdote from a farmer in that publication I mentioned, where she says, on-farm trials represent a powerful way for farmers to gain agency and support in solving our most pressing challenges. So what can on-farm field trials look like? The short answer is all kinds of different things, right? You can test so many different things on your farm. On the far left here, we have a trial comparing the effects of strategic tillage versus no-till on soil health and farmer well-being. This is Reyna Yagi, who you'll hear from in a moment. In the center, we have a lovely photo of different types of corn from Kristen Leach, second generation seed. So this was from a crop breeding trial with waxy corn that she did, and she shared this photo with me to use in this presentation. So you could be testing different varieties. You could also be testing different products. So here I am on the far right with some researchers from UC Davis. We're comparing the effects of different organic and biological pruning wound protectant products on diseases in apples and pears. So this is hosted by Scott Heath and Ellen Cavalli at Tilted Shed Orchard. So on-farm trials can look like all sorts of different things. These are just some examples. So I'm going to go through this really nice diagram in that resource I mentioned that walks you through the steps of an on-farm trial. So step one is identify your research question and hypothesis. And I love this example because this is the exact kind of research that I do as well. So I've actually done this trial before that we're going to use as an example in the guide. So maybe you want to know, can mulch help me increase blueberry yield? So your research question needs to be meaningful and achievable. So you need to actually be able to answer it with the tools that we have at our disposal. And your hypothesis is just what you think is going to happen. Step two is identifying what you're going to measure. So how will I know if mulch helps or not? What will you measure to answer your question? What kind of data do you need? How are you going to collect that data? What are your methods going to be? And what tools, skills, and resources do you need? Maybe you kind of already know what to do, or you have the tools you need, or maybe there's something you need to learn or some piece of equipment you need. Step three is choose an experimental design. So how should I arrange my trial in the field? What's this going to look like on the ground? And what's it going to look like so that you can make really strong direct comparisons? What's your control going to be? This is really important. If you're trying out a new practice, like this example uses mulching, you need a control to compare that mulch to. So you can't just mulch your whole farm or orchard or blueberry field. You need some areas that are not mulched in this example. So that's going to be your control. You can also think about it more broadly like, okay, what's my current practice or my standard practice compared to this new practice that I want to try? So I want to spend a little more time on step three because it's super important. So as we all know, farms are not uniform blank slates, right? We deal with variation across farm, whether it's topography or soil or pests or whatever. So they're not uniform blank slates. So how can you reduce variation due to your site variability so that you can make clean treatment comparisons with a lot of confidence? So the first answer is replication. So this just means the number of times or locations where you're going to repeat your treatment comparisons. So here I'm representing that as these big blue rectangles. So we're calling these blocks. So you have 4 blocks in this example on the right. You need at least 4 replicates to make really good comparisons. Ideally, it'd be nice to have a little bit more than that, but at least 4. And this is going to minimize variation and bias in your trial due to site characteristics. If you just compare treatments in one block, you might not get very representative results, and then maybe you draw conclusions that really wouldn't be true throughout your whole area. And the second answer to that question is randomization. So within your trial area, you want to randomly assign locations for each treatment. And in this case, we're talking about mulch versus no mulch. So you want to ensure your treatments are not always placed in the same order. They're random. This is going to minimize variation again. And how do you do this? You could flip a coin or pull some numbers out of a hat to assign locations. If you've got more than just 2 treatments, for instance, number out of a hat works. I've done both. So in this situation here now we have those 4 blocks still, but we've added in 8 plots. So these plots are, they contain your treatments. So our treatments are just mulch and no mulch. So mulch is represented here with that brown shading. And this is a real field trial. I've implemented this in an olive orchard to compare the effects of mulch versus no mulch on yield in a really stunted olive orchard. So, this could be as simple as this, and then you just collect some yield data and compare. And this is a really nice example of a randomized complete block design. This is a really, really common experimental design that you see in ag science. It's super straightforward. So you just start by sketching your blocks. Each block is going to contain your treatments, and then you divide those blocks into plots so that each plot receives a treatment. And this is just an example. That guide that I mentioned has a lot of other really nice examples. They use visuals really well in that guide too. So this is just one situation. Okay, in step 4, you're going to choose your field and mark location of your plots. So what's the best area for your trial? I usually sketch it out. I'm kind of a visual person, so I like sketching it out first. Maybe you mark areas in the field somehow. I use flagging tape a lot in orchard field trials, but you can somehow assign numbers or labels to different rows in your trial so that you remember, okay, this is where I did this, or this is where I'm going to do that. So just setting yourself up for success that way can be really helpful. And then step 5 is establishing your trial and collecting data. So you implement your treatments, then you collect data systematically in an organized way, and you keep really good records and notes, whatever that looks like for you. Maybe it's pen and paper, maybe it's an iPad, iPhone, whatever works for you. But keep track of your data and also just take lots of notes. Even anecdotal stuff is just as valuable as data, as numbers. So I usually go all of the above, some, quantifiable data, but then also a lot of notes about what you're seeing. And then step 6 is analyze your data. In this example, we're talking about yield. So how does yield data compare across treatments in my trial? Evaluate and compare data for your treatments. You could visualize the data in plots in Excel. This could be super simple and make treatment comparisons. Maybe you just want to know averages, and that's great for you, So think about what kind of data is going to be meaningful for you and how are you going to compare it in a way that's really useful. If you want to go the statistics route, I'd highly recommend talking with a technical assistance provider for help, unless you have that skill set already. And if you're going to do that, it'd be great to loop in a technical assistance provider at the beginning of your planning, before you do all this, and just ask for assistance with experimental design too. And step 7 is draw conclusions and share. So in this case, this guy found that mulching can help increase blueberry yield. So what did you find? How will you use your findings to help guide your own decisions? But also, who else might want to know about your findings? Maybe there's other farmers nearby who are trying out similar things or who might try out the same practice if they had a little more information about it. So, this could be a great opportunity to chat with your neighbor farmers, maybe do a presentation at the CAFF Small Farms Conference next year, that kind of thing. So it's always nice to share information, even if it's just, a couple highlights of key findings. Okay, so just to wrap up, I'm going to give a couple practical tips for success based on my own experience working in a lot of different types of field trials and agricultural systems in California. First and foremost, I highly, highly recommend keep it really simple so you can be confident in your conclusions. It can be straightforward. That can actually be really powerful to keep it simple. Number 2 is keep it achievable. So start small and focused. There's usually tons of questions that are worth exploring, but I would recommend just start with one and start small and focused, knowing you can always do another trial in the future. You can add on components, that kind of thing later. Just start small. And then number 3 is stay organized. So create a system or structure that works for you. Everyone's a little bit different. Maybe you really like Excel. You could use Excel to enter data. Maybe, you have an app that you like. So take lots of photos, it's just whatever works for you. Make sure that you have a system that will help you stay organized. And just to emphasize again, research does not have to be super complicated. I personally prefer really simple field trials because it allows me to make strong comparisons. So, you can set it up a lot of different ways. There's lots of examples in that guide I mentioned, but just know it doesn't have to be super complicated. And lastly, I wanted to mention your support network. So there are a lot of folks and organizations out there who are here to support you in this. Like I mentioned, I work with UC Cooperative Extension. I'm a farm advisor based here in Sonoma County. But if you go to our website, UC ANR, if you can see this map here, you can actually click this drop down and look for your county. So if you haven't already connected with advisors in your county and your region, definitely see who's around to help you out. CAFF also has a really awesome website with this nice map where you can see who's in your region. Definitely check that out. I know kitchen table advisors, they can be awesome resources on small farm business advising, as I'm sure many of you know. And sometimes they help out with research as well. And of course, if you haven't already, definitely connect with your local RCD or Resource Conservation District. There are these districts in all of these different regions in California. Many of them do research and can help you out in different ways there too. And then lastly, I wanted to mention the California Farm Demonstration Network, which is this great website where you can go and actually look for demonstration farms in your region, and you can even filter by region or production system or different practices and whatnot. So this is a really cool website if you want to see, okay, what kind of research are farmers doing in my region? Maybe who should I talk to? This is a really great resource too. Okay, thanks for listening. I'm going to stop sharing and see if we have any questions so far. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Ellie. Yeah, feel free to drop questions into our Q&A. But yeah, next up we have Reyna, who's actually on that CFDN network. But yeah, so we'll hear from Reyna about her research.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Sorry, I had to unmute, get the presentation going. Great. So, hi, I'm Reyna. I'm owner of Yagi Sisters Farm in Sebastopol in Sonoma County. And just a real quick background, we focus on centering ecology and diversity and localization and serving our community. Really just wanted to show some great photos too. That's what this presentation's for. And just some brief background too. It's about less than an acre that I have of a mixed vegetable herb specialty crop farm. Do about 25 varieties, selling mostly direct to restaurants, grocer, a sort of collaborative farm stand, all within Sonoma County, and also like to do educational visits and donation programs, that sort of thing. But what I wanted to, for the purpose of this topic too, I describe the operation as a semi-till operation while still incorporating agroecological practices like cover cropping, crop rotation, et cetera. But it brings me to some of the history of this land. So this parcel was very thoughtfully tended by Caiti, who's on this call, for about 7 years under no-till farming practices. And it really showed in the soil quality. And part of the reason I even decided to start my own operation was because Caiti had to let go of this parcel, unfortunately, but I saw it as an incredible sort of soil heirloom I was getting the opportunity to take on. So just major props to Caiti on that and creating more farmers. But that being said, this leads me to what I was experiencing as I was starting up my operation. So I had tractor farmed at a previous farms I'd worked at before, and also, of course, learned no-till, hand scale farming. And no-till was really attractive for a lot of reasons. It was really accessible, low cost to start. I, again, had Caiti's historical management knowledge of the land, which, as you all know, that's not what everyone gets all the time in taking on land. So it was really easy for me to incorporate that as I was getting going. In my second season of starting up, I was hitting a physical wall. I'm a one-woman operation. I basically strung on my parents to help me out once a week with harvest, but you have to keep it pretty slim when you're this small. And I was just experiencing some terribly chronic pains. I don't really want to go into it, but let's just say, like, I'm not in my mid-20s and my body's less forgiving. And so body resiliency became a pretty top priority for me. So I started flirting with a BCS walk behind tractor because it seemed to fit my size, right? Versus going full on tractor. But I happened to be talking with Ellie as she was in her new UCCE role and getting to know people. And we were already working together on soil testing. And she was helping me dive deeper into like understanding for soil fertility because like Caiti did an amazing job. I really like having some metrics, and I was like, let's just get this tested, and she was really helping me dive deeper on topics like I wanted to know more about. So I started talking to her about how I was juggling this whole no-till versus till, the struggle of compromising like this history of this land, and then of course the worry of my own like physical longevity, and like on top of like, okay, I can't really expand where I'm at. Like I would, I want to be able to maybe flip beds more often, more than I thought of land expansion. So the BCS seemed like something that could help me do that. So this is all I know, an interesting research question, and there's another workshop like in a few weeks you can dive into if you want to know more, but I'm not going to get too super into it as much as I want to talk about like my thinking and what I was first considering in this decision making process. So Ellie was the one who even suggested, I was like baffled talking about what do I do, that I could turn this decision making into a research trial. So to me, I was like, hey, I already wanted to do this. I wanted to be more informed about my decision. I'd like to have some metrics. And so I was going to make the change to the BCS regardless, but I just had this opportunity with this research trial to accompany that process and help me affirm and track my decision making. So what we did is we tested basically what is one strategic pass of the BCS over between, we used 2 beds, but we cut them up into 4. I'm sorry, my slide shows you that. Basically mix them up into 4 different plots of how we test the BCS versus no-till on 2 beds that grew, I believe, lettuce. So anyways, with the greater study being focused around soil health versus farmer health, which you heard Ellie refer to in her presentation. So I felt, so besides that I was in alignment with Ellie about my research question, and she was sort of affirming like, hey, you can, here's another way of looking at it, or here's how you can think about it. 2 other major pieces struck this home for me to even do it, which was number one, Ellie's guidance on how to even conduct it, right? I feel like there's this need to like know like I have to know so much to do this. And in all reality, no, that's your TA providers are there for. So she helped lay out the steps pretty clearly of how we would do it and that we would be doing it together. It wasn't like, here's a bunch of equipment, good luck, but this was on top of her also being able to get some funds to cover some of the costs of like the soil test, for instance, which again, I was going to get the soil tested regardless. And what farmer doesn't like a 2-for-1 where I'm getting something covered? So I thought that was, that was a big get. The other piece that really struck it home was honestly Ellie herself. So I just want to like outline her as a really great example of a TA provider that she's really done her footwork getting to know this farming community really well when she started out. And besides being just a brilliant human with a great soil background, she's just an excellent collaborator. And she understood really how best to work with farmers, our schedules, our chaotic weather, how we don't respond to emails very quickly, and what it meant to just ask them of our time. Like that's my biggest question. It's not that we don't care, that we want to like, conduct these trials or we have big questions or we want to know the science. We're like, I just don't know if I have time to do that. I need someone to kind of just help me get answers. So that was really huge. She was really adaptable, understanding, flexible. And there are moments where I was like, as the trial went on, I was like, I don't know if I could do this on time or things are getting crazy. Or, I kind of pulled myself back in. It was like, she assured me how we could still accomplish these aspects of the trial, with all the variables of, running a farm in peak season. And so I stuck with it. But overall, I saw on-farm research as just another type of decision-making tool, right? But more formalized. So I mean, even in this picture, like I'm running the BCS, Ellie's timing me. Like I can't really do that, but you kind of need another person to do some research on your farm. So there's like physicality of having someone there. But yeah, and then there's Ellie doing some of the soil tests, which is awesome, all professional. And then I threw in a picture of an egret because I took that recently. I think it's really awesome. It's just a little mid-presentation break. But yeah, it was just incredibly a lot of pluses over minuses, right, of doing it. And so I will say my initial I'll call it hesitations, but it's questions too, was, again, what kind of time was this going to ask of me? Was it going to pull me away from my day-to-day too much? Could I justify doing this? Like it was only my second season of starting my operation. I was like, like maybe this is bad timing, but in all reality, if I zoom out, it was good timing. I was making a critical decision, right? And what the future of my farm might look like, at least for that season and going forward. So was it going to be expensive? We go again, I was able to talk through with Ellie what are all the aspects and parts and pieces that I could look forward to. Because, right, you're farm planning all the time. How does this trial integrate into everything else on the farm? And it's really, it just did anyways. But Ellie was really great at softening those concerns, again, help me form a proper research question, resource me with tools, tests, know-how. I have to say, it's like having another hand at the farm. Again, I'm a solo person. She was really clear the whole way of what was being asked of me, right? Like, you can give you a general idea of like, okay, here's what your trial is going to look like, blah, blah, blah. But like, I kind of needed the constant like, okay, what's our next step, or what's that look like? Or she needed to hear from me too, just like, how realistic is that for you to do right now, right? Things are always changing, and so we found a good rhythm to keeping in good collaboration with each other. But anyways, besides getting an answer to my question, the slide is meant to show you that she helped me create, she really did create these materials for the farm, right? These are communication and promo pieces I can use for whether I do tours or I do a workshop or I just wanted to share it with people. Like, these are things that have been created for the farm now and are just indelible in perpetuity for use at the farm. This is a picture of Joji Muramoto. Like, Ellie just happened to like introduce me to him, which was great. He was actually hosting a similar trial or involved in a similar trial that we were doing. And we got to like sort of cross-pollinate and chat. And that was really great. The other people that I was able to connect to in this whole research process. And of course, soil test result interpretation. She was hands down always there for that to continue. Again, she was with me my second year of doing a soil test. So it's like having another brain, another person to bounce or to rely on. So ultimately, I saw this being, again, it's being a fairly small farmer and fairly solo. I saw this and technical assistant folks like Ellie as really just a part of my network of resources and options, a farmhand, and even just to help me invest in good decision making and literally, again, just being another person to bounce ideas off of, right? You cannot sit in a field for too long and hear your own thoughts on repeat. You've got to talk to somebody about it and get and talk it through. It goes so far, which is why I also love to hear about other experiments that happen on other farms, right? Like, tell me how you did it with all the other 15 things you carried in your mind. I want to know how you did this, right? So the real world applicable on-farm research, as Ellie had introduced, is pretty key to me feeling motivated to do it. So this is just a photo of all the people that have helped me on my farm, and just an example of like, I've just in all reality just need this in order to do my day-to-day, to have this kind of help. And I think it's really worth incorporating into your mindset and running your farm and making these decisions. So I'll end with saying the experimentation continues. So thanks to, again, Caiti and Ellie, because the WSARE grant, which you'll hear about from Caiti, had come on, and again, motivated by Caiti's, like, she had gone through the process. She's like, try it, you could do it, all these things. And then Ellie offered to be my TA collaborator for the WSARE. I said, okay, I'll try it, and it's another chance to actually do some more on-farm research, which again, Caiti will get into it, but I can get some funding to help me with some actual on-farm experimentation for a crop I'd really like to like break into with my clients and like do some market research and things like that. And so I didn't even know that kind of thing it even existed, honestly. And so I hope all of you here, learn a lot more about that today. And but just another opportunity to sort of fund what you already want to do with your farm and get some real support from it. So again, working with someone like Ellie and then having a farmer network of support in this was really just motivating my confidence in taking charge of research on my farm, right? We're always kind of doing it in a little way here, right, as farmers, but it felt great to know that I had some solid metrics and someone there to walk me through my decision making ultimately. So I'll stop sharing there.
Thank you so much, Reyna. Yeah, it can seem daunting, but I'm so glad you all have like Ellie to really pitch research in a less daunting way. And really great to hear your story. I also just want to shout out the event that's going to happen at your farm in a couple weeks. I think Ellie dropped the link in the chat. So definitely, if you're in the area, sounds like a great event to go to. Let's see. I'm up next. see. Um, yeah, so we covered sort of the motivation and research question drafting process with Reyna. And so once you have your research question, a big part of that will be how will you collect data to answer that question, right? So I wanted to cover just some of the tools and tests that you can do, especially at a smaller scale. And obviously, these will depend on what your question is. So I'll be covering some general questions like soil health, insect or pest management, and things like plant growth, like your weeds or your cover crop or even your crop yields. So we're talking about some tests that you can answer some of those general questions. And obviously, with these tests and tools that you use, idea is that you're collecting samples from every single block, and you're doing it in a standardized way so that you can compare the results between them. Because we all know like farms are very, very variable, so you want to kind of control as much as you can in terms of the exact practice that you're testing out. Um, so yeah, for the first question, for soil health, a lot of this will be tested with soil sampling. And I wanted to, well, I'll be pulling a lot from this NRCS guide. It covers some in-field assessments that you can do. There's sort of more general observations that you can make on top of like doing soil sampling and sending it to a lab to get it tested. But this is a great one. So I pulled out some of the assessments that you can do. There's a bunch of them in this guide. But the first is doing soil sampling with soil augers. This is basically just a tool that lets you soil sample at different depths without disturbing the soil too much, which, if you use a shovel or something, that would really be disturbing your soil. But basically, yeah, it just allows you to observe some of the different soil characteristics and how they change as you get deeper into the soil. So something like soil moisture would be good to like be able to see how deep is my water actually infiltrating, right? And if you're maybe adding compost or something, you want to see like how much is that getting incorporated, how deep is that getting incorporated. And so it's just a useful tool for either when you're collecting soil samples or if you're just wanting to look at your soil at these different depths. Some other things I recommend if you're doing soil sampling with the auger is that if you're, sampling at different depths, you want to do it at a range, and then you want to mark that on the auger beforehand. You can use like tape or a Sharpie or something, just so that you kind of have an indicator of when you're getting close to that range. And then also rubber mallet is just helpful if it gets stuck or anything like that, just something to hit it with. And then buckets, you'll want to have one per like soil range that you're sampling. So, like 0 to 5 centimeters, 5 to 15, whatever those ranges are, you want to have one for each so that you can combine them and keep them separate as well based on the ranges. And then if you're collecting them to send to like a testing lab or something, you'll want to have Ziploc bags. And if you're doing multiple samples like throughout the day, you want to just make sure you don't leave them out in the sun and that they're not baking. Put them in the shade or somewhere nice and cool. But yeah, this is one of the most common tools that you'll see for soil sampling. And then another thing you can do is a soil aggregate test. So aggregates are just chunks of soil that have really good soil structure. They don't break apart too easily. And it's a sign of proper, soil health and water infiltration, good air exchange, good nutrient cycling. It's just it's a sign of a lot of good things happening in your soil. So one test you can do is to saturate your soil aggregates with water. And if they have integrity and then stay within the aggregate, and they don't break apart, that means that you have very stable soil aggregates. And so there are a couple tests you can see here. Basically, you just pop them in water and wait a little bit. And if they start to break apart and kind of just dissolve, that means you have very unstable soil aggregates. And that means, in the field, that would mean like if you irrigated, it would just like compact every time you irrigated, right? So that's one test for soil aggregates, which are a good indicator of soil health. Another thing you can look at are the plant roots. You want to look for healthy white roots with a lot of root hairs. That's a sign that the root hairs have, air pockets to go into and that they're not being suffocated. Another thing is you don't want your roots either, getting clumped, or if you say start growing sideways, that's a sign that there's some sort of compaction that's preventing them from growing straight down. And then you just, same thing with the soil aggregates. If they're sticking to the roots and not breaking apart the second you pull them out of the soil, that's a good sign that you have stable soil aggregates. And then, another thing is just looking at the biodiversity in your soil. So, you can go to your different blocks. You can bring out a shovel full of soil and do some counts, right, of what you find. Things like pill bugs or earthworms. You can sample for like the mycorrhizal fungi, which is just like a white filmy on the plant roots. A bunch of stuff living in the soil, and the more diversity you have, it's more of a sign of that there's just a good habitat for them within your soil. And especially if you have a range from like the smaller to the larger ones, that just means you kind of have a good food web happening within your soil. So these are just a couple of things I pulled out from that guide, but I definitely recommend looking at it. It has a lot of different tests that you can do, especially smaller scales and more accessible tests that you can do on top of sending to like a lab to get, some of those further details about like nutrients and available carbon and things like that. But to move on to pest management, if you're doing pest management practices, you'd want to do insect and arthropod sampling. And one of the best resources for that is the UCIPM website. They have all the different cropping systems, all the pests and weeds and diseases for each crop, and how to manage them, how to ID them, all the good information there. So if you're doing insect sampling, there are a couple of tools that you should have on hand. First being a hand lens or a loop. This just helps you look at the small critters while you're out in the field. And then it's also helpful to have pictures. So if you want to get like a phone camera microscope, those are great to have pictures to send to like your advisor, or just get another opinion on like, is this what I think it is? And so that it'll get you higher magnification pictures. You can also have a sweep net and do some brush sampling. Basically, you standardize how many sweeps you do, and you might do 10 sweeps and then check what's in your net, right? And so that'll give you an idea of what you're catching out there. You can also use traps. So something like a sticky card trap is just an adhesive card. You put it out there for a week, and you come back and collect it and check, what did you catch? And another thing you could add to that is like a pheromone lure, depending on the pest. Certain moth pests and things like that use pheromones to find each other will be more attracted to these types of traps. So these kind of tools are useful when you're, if you're putting out a certain pest management practice and you want to test whether it's actually having an effect on your pest pressure. You can also observe like what kind of damage your pest is doing to your crops while you're doing all this. You can measure the insect diversity, so not just pests, but some of those beneficial insects and natural enemies that are out there. And if you're doing this pretty regularly, it'll also just help you with your management decisions, right? Of understanding when you need to like actually treat your pest pressure. And then one note on the scouting is that a lot of these practices that you might be, these alternative practices are relying on biocontrol. So it's important to understand what your natural enemies are. And the natural enemies are insects that like will eat or parasitize your pests and provide a natural control. So it's important to understand what they look like, what function they're serving, so that when you are doing your surveys and sampling, you're not confusing them for something else. And you understand like, oh, I do have insects that are helping me out in the field. So it's also, they also can look very different at different stages. So even something like a ladybug that's very famous and, very it's very easy to tell what it is, will look very different at a larval or pupa stage. Another thing is if you're talking about parasitoids too, they lay their eggs in the pest, and that obviously kills the pest, and then they emerge. But because of that, they're sometimes very small and it's hard to see them. So what you can actually look for instead is a sign of that parasitization happening in the pest. So you can see like this aphid with like that perfect circle where the parasitoid emerged. You can also see this white fly pupa with the parasitized one turns black. And then with something like stink bugs, the parasitized stink bug eggs will turn dark, and when the parasitoid emerges, the edges of where they emerged, the hole that they emerged from, will be pretty jagged. So there are different ways where you can see what kind of effect that your practices are having on your natural enemy populations as well. And then lastly, we have if you're just measuring plant growth, so this might be something like weed pressure, cover crop biomass, or even like your crop yield. What you want to do basically is make sure you're standardizing the area that you're sampling from. So using something like this, which is called a quadrat, it's basically just PVC pipes in a square, or you can use a hula hoop, same principle, but you basically just throw it down. And that's the area that you want to sample from. So you might, count how many weeds you have, look at the different plant species that are within that quadrat. If you want to measure biomass, you would cut down everything in that quadrat and then weigh it using like a hand scale like this. And if you're doing yield or something like that, that's also, you could cut down, harvest that yield and measure how much. If you're, planting in beds, one other method you could do is put down these flags. So like measure out like 1 or 2 feet, put down a flag on either side and harvest everything within those 2 feet. And that way you're not having to like harvest the whole bed or measure the whole bed. And that'll standardize the area that you're measuring from. And also if you leave the flags in, that way you can next week when you come back, you'd be like, okay, that's where I measured from last time. And it'll just help you remember. So yeah, those are a couple tools that are very accessible, especially for if you have these type of questions about like soil health or pest management or some like weeds or anything like that. So yeah, those are some of the tools that are available. And I pulled a lot of this from NRCS and ECIPM, and they have a lot of great resources for if you're wanting to get into other types of data collection. So yeah. That's all for my portion, and I'll pass it off to Caiti to wrap us up.
Thanks, Millie. Thanks for having me. First, we only have till 4, is that right? Just so I know how quickly to talk. Is that correct?
Yeah,
Okay.
4:15, but time for
4:15.
questions.
Okay, great. And then I was just gonna maybe actually request that if you guys want to put the links to the resources you guys were talking about, NRCS and the one that you were putting, Ellie, I am seeing a lot of questions around those, your presentations, and linking those resources might be helpful. I just put the link to the Western SARE grant in the chat, and that's what I'm going to be talking about a little bit. So my name's Caiti, and I own Red H Farm in Sebastopol in Northern California. And I've been farming for about 16 years, and on a small scale farm that's also similar to Reyna's, no-till, diversified vegetables, growing historically for farmers markets and some wholesale and some restaurants. Might feel a little bit of a theme here. Over the last like 5 years or so, I started struggling with some health issues and burnout, some pretty severe burnout, and was trying to kind of reassess how I was going to shift my farming operation to make it more viable so I could continue growing food for my community. And that's when I decided to shift my model really drastically into a winter CSA model. So growing more long-term crops that were lower labor and seeing if I could remain viable with kind of that whole different market, whole different kind of crops, whole different system. And I was pretty open and public about the changes I was going to make. A lot of it had to do with climate change and some of the shifting weather patterns that we have in Northern California. It's in my experience, a lot hotter than it used to be when I started farming. So I was open talking about it, and I think like posting about it on Instagram. And actually, someone from Western SARE, so WSARE stands for Western Sustainable Ag Research and Education, and someone from WSARE reached out to me and said, "Hey, I think this would actually be a great research project. You should think about applying." I didn't know anything about WSARE. So if you check out the link that I just put in there, WSARE has a lot of different research programs. Some of them are like farmer university projects that you can suggest. Some of them are some of them are grant programs that provide grants for farmers working with professionals or with technical assistance providers, and some of them are the kind of grant that I got, which is called the Farmer Rancher Research Grant. And so essentially, what you can do is propose any kind of research project you want through their portal, and get funds to do a 1 to 3 year research project. And so mine is quite a bit different than, for instance, what Moet was just talking about, and it's much more sociological, in fact. So I decided, based on this WSARE rep's kind of suggestion of applying, that I would just throw in an application to look at whether a few different questions about the winter CSA model that I was thinking about trialing. And I thought I'd look at whether there was a model for it, or sorry, a market for it, by looking at, how many CSAs shut down in the winter and doing some surveys of my farmers market customers and my community in general. Whether or not it was economically competitive with the model that I had been using. So from the perspective of providing a control, like Ellie was talking about, that was very difficult for me in a lot of ways, because I hadn't been doing consistent research, and I hadn't been doing the same kind of tracking and research in my original farming model. So I had to kind of make some assumptions about that, but the economics were one thing that I did track closely, obviously. And so I was able to create a research question, just doing a kind of a simple comparison. And then the biggest piece was looking at farmer health and well-being, and whether or not switching to the CSA model, while hopefully remaining kind of economically competitive with my previous model, would also, facilitate me working fewer hours, taking more vacations, and essentially just feeling better overall on like a scale of 1 to 5. So I did some really simple field note taking and scoring every day, tracking my hours, scoring how I felt on a scale of 1 to 5 about the day, and taking field notes so I could reference them back. So very subjective, very, very subjective. And then tracking how many days off I took, how many vacations I was able to take. And not having a control for that, I had to really make some kind of assumptions and kind of not guesses, educated guesses about how things had been in previous years in order to provide the comparison. And so the details of my grant aren't particularly, the specifics aren't important, but I think it is important to recognize that your research can look both very like biological and scientific from a hard sciences perspective, and it can also look sociological, where there's an opportunity to do more sociological research. With the WSARE grant, you typically work, I was the primary investigator, and then I was lucky to already be working with kitchen table advisors. And because a lot of my questions were economic, my advisor from KTA was also kind of my like agency professional, because they do want you to have someone like Ellie or someone like Lily from KTA, who was my advisor, to work with you on it. And she was already working with me on the same kind of questions I was looking at. So it didn't add work to her plate in order to kind of support me in the questions I was asking. I think that one of the really important things that participating in the farmer rancher, or getting a farmer Rancher Research Grant did for me was it essentially subsidized the transition I was making on the farm. So something that Reyna said, she said, fund what you're already wanting to do. And I think that's really, really important. I was going to make this transition no matter what. I had no idea what the economic implications were going to be, but it was clear to me I could not continue farming the way that I had been. And so getting this grant provided like a huge, well, relatively speaking, a huge subsidy to my farm operation that allowed, it kind of provided a safety net and a cushion, not knowing what the economics of this new model were going to be. So the Farmer Rancher Grant is a $25,000 grant that you can apply for 1 to 3 years. And so my grant application, my original grant application was for 18 months. And so that grant provided an extra $25,000 in income for an 18-month period, which for me was huge. Some of that grant went to hard costs like printing my final report and renting a car so I could drive down and share information with farmers on the Central Coast, that kind of thing. But most of the money was a line item as income for me. So I think that's one of the great things about the Farmer Rancher Grant. I was able to decide how much I should earn, which I think I would probably do it more now, or I would increase my salary now, but I think I paid myself like $40 to $50 an hour for what I assumed would be about half an hour a day of like taking notes and doing assessment and things like that. So I was able to pay myself well to do things that I should have been tracking on my farm, like the hours that I work and the things that I'm doing anyway, that I hadn't necessarily made time for in the past. It also provided, like as a side note, a really great way for me to look at how much I was actually working with, which a lot of us don't necessarily track, and turns out is really important in terms of understanding why you're suffering from burnout and why you feel like shit. And so that was really, really helpful as well. The other piece of the Western SARE grant is the education piece. So in addition to doing your research, you are required to actually provide educational resources for people. So I think it's a really beautiful grant because it really encourages folks to build farmer to farmer relationships. And so I hosted tours with farmers. I hosted tours with agency folks like Ellie. I already do a lot of teaching at Sonoma State University and through Agroecology Commons and through Climate Farm School. So I had groups come out. When they came out, I would talk to them about the work that I was doing. So I was supporting new farmers and thinking about how they could farm differently, current farmers in like what results I was getting, and agency professionals in what results I was getting, so they could be shared with people throughout the state. And so I think that's one of the really great things about the Farmer Rancher Grant. What I will mention that I think is really important, and I saw a question about this in the Q&A, is that I recently got an email from Montana State University. That is the university that facilitates the grants. The WSARE grant is funded by the USDA, and they have frozen those funds as part of the Trump executive order. And they have told the email. I pulled it up, so I might as well just tell you what it said. They said, the executive orders and Office of Management and Budget memos have communicated restrictions on federal award spending, blah, blah, blah. We're working to identify and communicate how these changes will impact the federal programs and awards. Montana State is waiting for further guidance, as we all are, about any grant that we're getting. Until we receive clear guidance from the USDA that activities can proceed and will be reimbursed, because this grant is partially a reimbursement grant. MSU requests that all awardees pause their spending until further notice. Specifically, MSU has learned that all activities that could potentially be associated with diversity, equity, and inclusion need to cease effective as of January 29th, 2025. So that part of my grant funds are frozen. My work does not specifically address diversity, equity, and inclusion, but it does explicitly address climate change. And having a good friend that works at the USDA, I know that everything that's climate change related is also being flagged. And so whether or not, even if the grants come through, generally speaking, if they will pick and choose grants that are no longer going to be funded, remains unclear. So the way the WSARE grant works, they give you half of your grant allocation up front. So I received like a $12,000 check up front. Then a third of the way or halfway through the project or something like that, you have to do a progress report, and they give you another third, or they give you like another quarter. And then after the project's complete, they give you the fourth quarter. So I got the first grant, and then I re-upped to get a grant to study second and third year of the winter CSA, because you obviously can't really get any clear answers after 1 year of something on a farm. You need multiple years of information and research results. And so I'm at the very end of that grant. And so I've gotten most of my funds, but right now my final funding allocation is frozen and I have no idea whether I'll get it or not. So the question that came up is, are there other grants out there we can talk about that are not federally funded? And I will leave that to other folks, because mine certainly is federally funded and is being one of the things that's impacted. And as like a PSA, I would say there's 60 participants on this call right now. If everyone please take like 2 minutes when you're done with this call and call your congresspeople and your senators, your reps and your senators, and please request that they release funds for USDA, that the USDA release funds, and let them know how seriously farmers are being impacted. Like if everyone on this call does that, that's 60 more phone calls that are happening to people from throughout the state and the senators. And I know CAFF just posted some information about that. So I think the number's on there. And thank you, Keely, for just putting that link in the chat. It's really important. A lot of people are being really negatively affected. And that's about it. And if any, I can show, I don't know that it's important that I show the application itself, but if you go onto the WSARE website, there's an application on there with lots of different questions about like your research question, your objectives, your timeline, how much money you're asking for, budget, which is actually they've made very simple now, which is nice. I just copied all the questions into Google Drive, wrote all the questions out, copied them back into the form, and submitted the form. It did take a while. I know people that have done it in like 3 days. I think I took a few weeks, and I know other people who have done one and did it a couple months in advance. So it just kind of depends on if you're a like stay up all night before a test college student or not. But it's not impossible at all. It's not impossible. And I'm already, as we've been sitting here, thinking about another research project that I suddenly realized I should try to get funding for if WSARE opens back up. So I just highly recommend it. It's a really great resource for farmers and ranchers. And I'll stop so we have some time for questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Katie. Yeah, I know that farmers who've had the WSARE Rancher grant, and it's a really great one. Like you said, it's very flexible in what it'll fund. And I think, part of it is also this, extension and outreach, right? Sharing out what you learned from your project. So it's also building, someone in the chat talked about like, building the community around what you're doing is also very important. So I'm really glad you talked about it and kind of the state of where it's at right now, and what we all can do. But also, just the realities of these kind of programs, they're really great and support farmers, and they're really important to having farmers be able to do this kind of work, right? So yeah, I'm gonna say thank you all for just like sharing your stories and your experiences with doing something that I feel like every farmer is already doing. But yeah, wanted to have some time left over for questions. I don't know, I feel like most of them have been answered. See, I did want to highlight, I think Ellie put it in the chat in the quick Q&A section, but one other funding program is the Organic Research Foundation, I think, OFRF. They're the one who made the Farmer's Guide to Conducting Research. It is, targeted towards organic or transitioning organic growers, but that is another research-focused grant opportunity. And like Ellie said, a lot of your extension and, advisor, TA advisors are doing their own research and always looking for farms to do their research on. So those are people you should definitely reach out to. They're there to help you. So yeah. I think we have a couple.
Thanks. Yeah, and I'll just add really quickly, it's kind of hard to tell sometimes, like if funding for different on-farm research is coming from the USDA and how much for different grants. But I threw a couple in the Q&A. UC Syrup offers one research-focused small grant annually. I think a small portion of that might come from the USDA, but I don't think it's solely USDA, and I haven't heard of anything about that one not being offered. So that link to that is in the Q&A. Yeah, and the one that Moe just mentioned. And then also California has commodity boards for specific crops. So, the almond board, California, for instance, or like the pear board or things like that. So like they're very crop specific, but they do offer annual research funds. And you do need to go through like a cooperative extension advisor to collaboratively create design a research trial, focus on like questions that matter to you, but that also matter to growers of that crop throughout the state. And so that's like an industry-based fund for on-farm research that is not federally funded. So that I've thought a lot about this because so many of my farmers are diversified and they don't just grow one thing, but some of them do. So it's, or maybe you just want to focus on lettuce or something, so it's not perfect, but that's another funding source that exists. And definitely just talk to your cooperative extension advisor in your area about that too. Oh yeah, thanks for putting the Syrup link, Natalie, in the chat. That's great. So just wanted to expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, someone asked us to repeat. Yeah, just at your UC Cooperative Extension, so UCCE advisors are the ones who are mainly out there looking for farms to do trials on and trials with. And that's who Ellie works for. But there, like she said, there are county offices. So definitely search up where your county office is and who you should reach out to.
Yeah, and one last quick note, some trials you can do on a very, very low budget too. I mean, ideally, I would really like farmers to be paid for their time to do these research trials. But if you just want to do like a pruning trial, like you could do it, knock it out in like 1 or 2 days, you know what I mean? And then just measure yield. So there are ways to do on-farm research that are like really low cost, low labor too. So that's good to bear in mind also.
Yeah, reiterating, you can keep it simple, keep it small and manageable, and it's still research. So yeah, definitely. We have one question about the WSARE grant and does it provide grant write-up assistance?
Yeah, I was just
Katie.
writing something up, but maybe I'll just verbalize it. So I didn't participate in anything like that, but as I'm thinking about it, I believe they did have some workshops, and they provide some workshops throughout the year on different pieces. I will also say that I spent a lot of time writing up my final report, and one of my outputs was like a plain language final report that could be shared with farmers. And then I used that and I put it into my final report. The final report on WSARE is like it's again a form that essentially has all of your application materials in it that you have to kind of update with like taking everything from like I will do this to I did do this and then adding what the results are is actually like fairly easy. And after I spent so long working on creating my final report and then translating it and transferring it into their document and submitted it, it was accepted and like they were said I was done like the next morning at 9 a.m. and I felt like no one actually read it and I was a little bit disappointed to be honest. And I'm sure maybe somebody read it, but it wasn't as arduous as I thought it was going to be. Let's just put it that way. And I think that they do have some workshops that they offer and they're quite responsive. Like you have a grant manager who you can reach out to personally.
Yeah, definitely. And they have a projects database, which is just like all of these projects that they've funded and awarded, and all the project reports that come out of it. And so that's definitely a great resource if you're either, a question that you want answered might already be answered, or it's a great resource to look through of like what kind of questions are people asking and how should I frame my question so that it's different, but also fits the format of what this grant will fund. So I can drop the link in the chat later, but yeah, it's a really great resource. And then we have, oh, the question got answered. We have a question from Steve. Burnout and physical stress sound like a primary obstacle to the longevity of small farms. Are you aware of the small? Okay, so an alternative for the BCS. Q&A there. Let's see. Yeah. Any other questions? Let's drop the project database for the Western SARE grant. So yeah, I think look, we don't have any other questions. Oh, what are the regenerative and syntropic grants research? Are there any specific to those? Not sure what syntropic is, but Western SARE is pretty focused on the regenerative side. So that's definitely one option. I don't know if anyone else has an answer for that. We have a question for Ellie on your experience with WSARE and that 3-year research for someone considering a long-term project themselves. I don't know if that's for Ellie or maybe for Caiti.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. So the Western SARE grant that funded my research was not the same as a farmer rancher grant. It was actually like a different type of Western SARE. So if you go to Western SARE's website with like all the different types of grants they offer, you'll see kind of how they outline like different types for different people and different goals and funding amounts and time span and that kind of thing. So it was like a different type of grant under Western SARE. So yeah, for me, I was a grad student at UC Davis. I needed a project. I was really excited about organic matter amendments. I had great advisors, and they said, "Hey, you should apply for this grant. We'll support you." So I had professors at UC Davis I was working with who helped me apply to that as a graduate student. So that was like a different type of grant than like a farmer rancher grant, where you don't have to be a grad student. It's that farmer rancher is specifically for like people who are currently farming, who are farmers. So it's just like a different type of Western SARE grant. But for my PhD, I did work very closely with commercial farmers so all of my research questions were based on what they needed and what they were asking. So it was a great collaboration, but like a very different type of grant. I hope that kind of helps. The farmer rancher grant, it sounds like you can like apply more than once, like Caiti did. So that's the good news. But also, yeah, funding right now is up in the air. So
Yeah, I'll just jump in and say, so with the Western SARE Farmer Rancher Grant, you can apply for a 1 to 3 year grant. So if you have a 3-year project you want to do, you can apply for a 3-year for a project that will take 3 years. However, regardless of the length of time that you apply, the cap is $25,000. So what I did was apply for 18 months that covered like research through my first winter CSA season, and then write up an education, like 12 months of research and doing the winter CSA. And then like I gave myself like 6 months or something as a period to do like write up and education work. And so I got $25,000 for those 18 months. And then I applied for a second round of funding, a year and a half in or something at one of their next deadlines to continue the research and study the second and third year of the CSA, so that I would have 3 years of data to provide a more comprehensive understanding of all of my questions and what the answers were. And so then I got another $25,000 almost for that next like 18 months that overlapped over the second and third season. So you can you never know if you're going to get the second grant if you apply again. So I did, which meant that I ended up getting $50,000 over 3 years rather than $25,000 over 3 years, if that makes sense. But it is a risk because you don't know if you'll get the grant that second time. So if it's a grant that's not going to take a ton of time, or a project that's not going to take a ton of time, you can just apply the 25,000 to the full 3 years from the get-go, and get like $8,000 a year kind of thing. Hopefully that's helpful.
I think all the questions. So yeah, thank you so much to our panelists, and thank you all for attending. And yeah, I hope y'all have questions that you want to answer and are ready to do some trials. So yeah, I think that's it for us, Keto.
Yes, thank you all so much for coming. I hope you learned a lot. Like we said, the recording is going on YouTube. I think you have the facilitator's emails or a way to contact them. So yeah, that'll be it for today. Thank you, everyone.